Hello, my name is Todd Hagstette. I am an associate professor of English at the University of South Carolina, Aiken, and I am moderating a panel for the Society for the Study of Southern Literature at the American Literature Association Conference. I want to thank everybody who is tuning into this video and thank the panelists that will be joining me today for what I hope is going to be an interesting conversation about the literature of the American South. The panels that the SSSL are hosting this year are a little bit special because they're tied into a forthcoming edited collection from Routledge Press called The Companion to the Literature of the U.S. South. And all of our participants today are contributors to that volume. Specifically, they are all participating in a section of that book called Trajectories in Southern Studies, which is a section focusing on the upcoming new novel approaches to studying the region and the literature. And so I am personally very excited to hear their talks today. I'll be introducing them one by one as they come on board to delight us with their information. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a little time for some Q&A, even in this pandemic-inspired electronic format. So to start things off, I would like to introduce Matthew Teutsch, who is the director of the Lillian Smith Center at Piedmont University. He is also the author of a blog on literature, culture, and pedagogy called Interminable Rambling. And he's published articles and book reviews in a lot of venues, including Lear and Nelis and Mississippi Quarterly, African American Review, and Kowloon. His research focus is primarily on African American, Southern, and 19th century American literature, and he is the editor of Rediscovering Frank Yerby Critical Essays, which is a 2020 publication. And very interesting, his current project is about Christopher Priest's run on the Black Panther comics. So I'm interested to hear about that as well. You can also follow him on Twitter at Silas Lapham. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Teutsch. You're muted, Dr. Teutsch.
I'm unmuted now. So yeah, like I said, I just turned off my camera because I'm actually reading as I go and I printed it out. That way you can look at the PowerPoint instead of looking at me. As well, this is not a totally in-depth and exhaustive talk about comics in the U.S. South. There are good books. Kiana Whitted and Brandon Costello's book, I think it's actually titled Comics in the U.S. South from University Press of Mississippi, is a good kind of start. And some of the things that I talk about are in that book, this collection of essays. But when I thought about this topic, kind of what I decided was starting off a little bit earlier. I mean, we think of comics as 1900s, you know, coming into today, but I actually start with E.W. Kimball. So writing in 1930, and we know E.W. Kimball from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, he relays the story of the century's art director, W. Lewis Frazier, seeing advanced chapters of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with Kimball's illustrations, and here are some here, and asking the artist to see more of his, quote, Negro drawings. Kimball provided Frazier with illustrations for some stories from various Southern authors, such as Thomas Nelson Page and George Washington Cable, and they got published. According to Kimball, one of the authors who he does not name even told Frazier, quote, "At last you have an artist who knows the South." Kimball adds, "I was established as a delineator of the South, the Negro being my specialty, and as I have mentioned, I had never been South at all." This picture right here is actually from Paul Laurence Dunbar's Nels I forgot the exact title, Nels Hatton's Vengeance, which has nothing to do with this boy fishing. There's just one line in there that deals with that, but yet that's the image that Kimball decided to illustrate. And that story actually deals with Nels Hatton, he lives in Ohio, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've read it. But his former owner comes to his house, doesn't know that he enslaved Nels and all this. And it's kind of this coming together of his former owner and Nels, who has made something of himself in the Ohio town. That's the story. Yet Kimball's illustration focuses on a stereotypical image of a young Black boy fishing. Okay. While Kimball didn't work in comics, his comments about becoming a delineator of the South through his illustration serves us well when considering the South in sequential art. Kimball relied heavily on minstrel shows and stereotypes, as you see here, in his visual construction of African-American Southerners, and his audience bought into these constructions. Like Kimball, Alfred Gerald Kapp, creator of Little Abner's comic strip, relied on stereotypes that he imbibed from local color and regional authors at the turn of the 20th century in his depiction of Appalachia and its inhabitants. There's a good essay in Costello and Whitted's book about this. That's where I got some of this information. As M. Thomas Inge puts it, Little Abner and Billy DeBeck's Snuffy Smith, quote, were created by non-Southerners who used the region at first mainly for local color and achieved little semblance of Southern culture in their renditions. Ultimately, they portrayed the South as a region that was either primitive or exotic, and the region was used to represent the pastoral ideal and to recall a pre-modern era. This characterization of the South continued well into the 20th century, particularly in works by non-Southern creators at the Big Two, what people call the Big Two comics, Marvel and DC, who created Southern characters and crafted stories set in the South for ongoing series such as Swamp Thing, Captain America, X-Men, and the New Mutants. These are just some of the covers. This is Rogue's first appearance. She's from Mississippi. This is Cannonball's first appearance, Swamp Thing. If you've watched The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, John Walker is a character within the Captain America universe, came into the 80s. He actually took over for Captain America, Steve Rogers, when he stepped down, and Lamar Hoskins was his sidekick. So there's a whole kind of run with this, and John Walker's from Alabama. So there are discussions of the South and the moral majority, kind of all these types of things are discussed within kind of this run. And there was even, Lamar's name Battlestar comes from this too, because initially his name was Bucky after Bucky Barnes. So he became the new Bucky. But then readers responded and said, that's a very stereotypical term for an African-American man. So they changed it. So, but that's a whole nother story, but just to kind of show you kind of the representations here. Lin Wen and Bernie Wrightstein created DC Swamp Thing in 1971. But the move to British comic book writer Alan Moore, who took over the series in 1984, brought about a more focused engagement with United States Southern history and its landscapes of horrors, as Whitted points out, specifically through the engagement with the South's legacy of enslavement. Moore and artists such as Stephen Bissette deployed Gothic elements in the series, and notably in issues that deal with the legacies of racial oppression. To, as Michał Wester puts it, when writing about the Gothic existence in African-American literature, revised the Gothic genre's tropes in unique ways, both to speak back to the tradition's originators and to make it a capable and useful vehicle for expressing the terrors and complexities of Black existence in America. As Alan Moore and artists such as Bissette presented the continued lesions of racial violence in the South and the nation, another British-born comic book writer, Chris Claremont, presented the South as an idyllic space devoid of the scabbed over wounds that have never healed. Claremont and Michael Golden introduced the X-Man Rogue in Avengers Annual number 10, and that's Avengers Annual number 10 right there. Rogue's Southernness, trying to find my thing real quick. Rogue's Southernness only appears superficially through her speech, and we do not see Caldecott County, Mississippi, her fictional hometown, which exists between Natchez and New Orleans, until 3 years later in Uncanny X-Men 185. Speaking with the Clarion Ledger in 2016, Claremont talked about creating Rogue, saying, I felt, why should Louisiana get all the fun? And Gambit, who she's kissing right there, is Louisiana, New Orleans. Here's a whole another issue. Mississippi was a place where the racial divisions and relationships were viewed in perhaps more stark terms in and around New Orleans. Even though Claremont mentions the tensions between, quote, fun, as I say, beauty, and, quote, racial divisions, as I put it, violence, in his comments, Rogue never confronts the bloody soil of Mississippi. Instead, she basks in the moonlight magnolia of the Old South. Describing Caldecott County in Uncanny X-Men 185, the narrator says, this is farming country. This is the first time we see it. Where once cotton was king and stately mansions lined the river, setting a standard for style and affluent, gracious living that was the envy of the world. It was a way of life people believed would last forever. Cotton had long been dethroned, and most of the great estates had fallen into ruin. The narration, along with John Romita Jr. and Dan Green's panels, which depict pastoral images of the banks of the Mississippi River, don't mention the enslaved who made cotton king and built the mansions. They don't exist in this narrative. Even when Robert Rhodey fleshed out Rogue's background in her posthumous 2004 series, setting the action directly in Caldecott County, and he's from Chicago, I believe, originally, he does not broach any discussion of the South's past and its continued influence in the present. Claremont also introduced the Cajun X-Men Gambit, and I have issues with him being Cajun in the New Orleans. That's a whole nother discussion too. And this is Gambit and Storm on the right there. And the Kentucky and New Mutant Cannonball into the Marvel Universe. During his tenure, Claremont only places Gambit in the South and New Orleans once, exoticizing the city and the region by focusing on Mardi Gras and stereotypes. While Gambit South exists as nothing more than set dressing in a fantasy, Cannonball South does address mining and its impact on Appalachia and Cameron County, a stand-in for Harlan County. However, the character in this story do not broach, as Martin Loon notes, the strikes or unionization or labor politics that were the reality of the area for so long. Even though depictions of the South in ongoing comic series from Marvel and DC often present the region in an exoticized and idyllic manner, graphic novels and memoirs alongside other series from publishers such as Image, Boom, and Vertigo reckon with the history of the South through realism, the Gothic, and more. Jason Aaron, writer and co-creator of Image's Southern Bastards, which is a very problematic series, by the way, lays out the ways that his Southernness influences his writing, pointing out how it seeps into characters such as the Canadian X-Men Logan and the God of Thunder Thor in his writings. His Southernness, though, is a push-pull affair, as is with many artists. As he puts it in the introduction to Southern Bastards Volume 1, the trade paperback, I love the South. The South also scares the living shit out of me. And Aaron's white, and so is the illustrator, Latour. Unlike creators such as Cap, Claremont, and Moore, Aaron and co-creator Jason Latour bring their Southernness to the gritty series, one that draws on the beauty and the violence of the South, foregrounding the love-hate relationship with the region. Southern Bastards pulses through the system in the vein of Southern Gothic authors like O'Connor, Faulkner, and Moore, crafting deeply flawed characters who confront themselves, the South, and as Latour says, its absurdities. Ultimately, Aaron and Latour don't reckon, though, with the South and the nation's past. Instead, they rely at many turns on well-worn tropes and stereotypes, particularly Old Big, who becomes a magical Negro character to Euless Boss, and hyperbolic depictions of rednecks such as Esau Goins. The series could, through characters such as Roberta Tubb, delve more into embedded intersections of race, religion, and sex in the region, but they skirt those deeper explorations. Other creators, however, confront the South's festering sores in different ways, either through historical graphic memoirs and narratives or through fictional works that pull on the cultures of the various regions in the South itself. From Appalachia and Eric Powell's Hillbilly to Alabama and the Civil Rights Movement and John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell's March, and Lisa Quintero Weaver's Darkroom, to the fictional Caron, Mississippi, and Jeremy Love's Bayou, to Cajun, Louisiana, specifically Lafayette, and Rob Guillory's Farmhand, to Houston, Texas, and Nate Powell, Jim Demakis and Mark Long's The Silence of Our Friends, and more. While enslavement in the mid-1800s served as the basis for historical works such as Cal Baker's Nat Turner and David Walker, Damon Smith and Marisa Louise's The Life of Frederick Douglass, multiple works depict narratives from the Civil Rights era. Comics played a large role in the Civil Rights movement. Martin Luther King, the Montgomery Montgomery Story, a 10-cent comic from the Fellowship on Reconciliation, which details the Montgomery bus boycott, inspired civil rights activists such as Azelle Blair, Joseph McNeil, and John Lewis. During a workshop in Nashville in 1958 in preparation for the Freedom Rides in the early 1960s, Lewis received a copy of the King comic. When Representative Lewis's digital director and policy advisor, Andrew Aiden, heard about the comic, the two began to talk about writing a comic about Lewis's life, and Aiden had to kind of push him into it, which would detail Lewis's childhood, meeting King, sit-ins, Freedom Riders, the Selma March, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, all interspersed with the inauguration of Barack Obama in January 2009. The FOR's comic appears in March as Martha Cutter, and Kathy Shalhoub Viala's note. March places itself within a concurrent meditation on the ways in which written and visual text can serve underrepresented groups. Comics such as March provide a space to counter the whitewashed narrative of the era by presenting, through the juxtaposition of image and text, the experiences of those who lived it, not merely through the news accounts. Likewise, works such as Weaver's Darkroom counter prevailing narratives. Darkroom details Weaver's and her family's experiences as Argentinian immigrants in Alabama during the Civil Rights era. Jorge Santos points out that through her work, which reproduces some of the images her father took as a photojournalist, Weaver brings to the fore often unheard and unseen Latino and Latina contributions to the civil rights movement from outside a strict black-white positionality. The one on the left is from Weaver. As well, Weaver highlights through the ways that individuals label her and her family as either white or black, depending on the situation, the social constructions of race. Graphic novels such as Howard Cruz's Stuck Rubber Baby work in a similar manner to Darkroom and March by blending fiction and reality, in this case, the narrative of Tolan Polk, who grapples with his sexuality against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. Works such as Love's Bayou, Guillory's Farmhand, and David Walker, Chuck Brown, and Sanford Green's Bitter Root all use what John Ira Jennings and Stanford Carpenter call the ethnogothic, science fiction and folklore to depict the push and pull of the violent history of the South and the beauty of the region, which I see in a lot of Southern writing. I'm thinking back to Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave specifically. It's kind of the first place I really kind of noticed that tension. Writing about Bayou, Whitted states, Love's aesthetic choices are particularly attentive to the paradoxes of pleasure and pain that distinguishes the Deep South. In this manner, each of these works, along with countless others, wrestle with not only the South's physical history, but also with the depictions of the region that appeared in the same medium where they exist. Representation of the South in comics, as in any form of art, from movies to literature, is not static, and it constantly encounters previous depictions and wide-held stereotypical imagery. However, creators continue to challenge these depictions through their works, and these are a couple of examples right here. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Teutsch. Very interesting. Next up, we have Michał Choiński, who is an associate professor of American literature at the beautiful Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. He is the author of 2 monographs, the latest of which, though, is the subject of today's talk, I believe. And that book is called Southern Hyperboles, Meta-Figurative Strategies of Narration, which came out from LSU Press last year. He is the author of approximately 30 academic articles on American literature, rhetoric, digital humanities, in various venues such as Mississippi Quarterly and America Studien. He also edited 3 volumes of essays on literature and cognitive linguistics, and a special issue of Polish Journal of American Studies dedicated to digital humanities and American studies. He has guest lectured at various universities in the US, and in 2022, he will be the Senior Fulbright Fellow at Yale University. And in a classic example of burying the lead outside of academia, and for almost a decade, he has been organizing underground and alternative music concerts, primarily, I believe, in the metal genre. So, a lot cooler than me. Dr. Choiński.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll share the screen now. Okay, can you see the screen? Yeah. All right. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. I'm delighted to be here, although the format is a bit unusual, and I wish I was there with you in the US, and I wish we could engage in this discussion in a more traditional format. I'm looking forward to this being possible again. So I'm obliged to say that the project I'm presenting is financed by the Polish National Ministry of Higher Education. So Hyperbole in the Writings of American Southern Authors, that's a project that was financed by National Science Center in Poland. And the outcome of it is, as you said, the book Southern Hyperboles, Metafigurative Strategies of Narration, that came out with LSU Press last year. Hyperbole is a common rhetorical trope that we rely on in everyday communication. It is frequently the basis of rudimentary, exaggerated complaints about the weather, of slapstick jokes, or elevated superlatives used to express emotions. At the same time, however, like other tropes, hyperboles can be viewed as much more than an element of the overt figurative fabric of language. They are modes of cognition. In his study on the poetics of the mind, Raymond W. Gibbs Jr. argues that, quote, the mind itself is primarily structured out of various tropes. These figures of thought arise naturally from our ordinary, unconscious attempts to make sense of ourselves and of the physical world. Troping is directly associated with epistemic processes and the patterns of comprehension. I'll be using this term throughout my speech. These patterns of comprehension one employs to process the surrounding world. In other words, we think through figures like metaphors, metonymies, and hyperboles. And for what's important from the point of view of a literary scholar, that these tropes organize the way we speak about speaking. The most salient component of the hyperbolic mode concerns upscaling reality and blowing it out of all proportions. Classical authors saw the trope of hyperbole as a means of oratorical amplification, often used in different forms of pathos, that is, persuasive appeal to emotions. Violations of balance, stability, and moderation become directly associated with rhetorical excess, and the trope was often viewed as contestable since it is so openly and purposely floating the principle of rationality and truthfulness, and as well as aesthetic decorum. This penchant to entrap logical discontinuities and fuse them together despite their repulsion remains at the basis of hyperbolic pattern of comprehension. This accounts for how hyperbole has been discussed and described by all various authors on rhetoric. Jacques Derrida talked about the demonic nature of hyperbole, and the authors of the New Rhetoric, Chaim Perelman and Loic Oblets-Titeka, said that it's fired with brutality. The open violations of the rules of decorum and logic that hyperbole entails make its operation subversive and fierce. As explained by Joshua Rittel, hyperbole dramatically holds the real and the ideal in irresolvable tension and reveals the impossible distance between the ineptitude and the infinite multiplicity of language to describe which is indescribable. Yet ultimately, this process of violent repulsion has constructive trajectory. When one hears a hyperbolic statement, and let's just imagine what's happening if you hear the following phrase, it's 1,000,000 degrees outside. Your mind goes into a very brief epistemic shock. That is, you test the truthfulness of the statement against what you hold as norm. It's usually not 1,000,000 degrees, it's 21 degrees, as it is right now in Poland. You have to reconcile these two opposites, and you have to read the illocutionary force of the statement, that someone is simply emphatically saying it's very hot, right? So there is a very complex, actually, cognitive process happening when you hear hyperbole. So when one hears hyperbolic statements, one's initial shock caused by the confrontation with logic discordance is swiftly followed by a realization that pierces through the sense of the impossible to give a sense to a new understanding. The hearers realize that the speaker using the trope does not actually imply the literal, exaggerated sense, but seeks to communicate something different. The meaning is revalued, reorganized, and refreshed. At the end of the day, the hyperbolic pattern of comprehension is a creative act, a generator of thought and meaning, as argued by Goran Stanivkovic. So what does it have to do with the American South? In the context, what is the connection between the hyperbolic mode of comprehension and the literature and culture of the American South? One has to acknowledge that no discussion about Southernness of Southern fiction can successfully proceed without such words as contradiction, paradox, or opposition. These seem to be unavoidably recurrent in the host of publications on the American South, where they are also customarily followed by a long enumeration of the phenomena within the American South that are fundamentally incongruent and yet by some strange alchemy of mind continue to coexist. It is this inherent, often haunted and paradoxical nature of Southern culture and its normative decorum that allows for the construction of a unique form of hyperbolic mode, one which underpins literary works by a host of authors from the region. In the context of the South, the hyperbolic mode of comprehension functions in a culture erected upon the normative decorum of convictions regarding race, gender, social status, and historical denial. The perennial strength of these rules for Southern culture has been visible in how they were maintained by social, economic, political, and religious institutions throughout the better part of the 20th century. This restrictive Southern code was a driving force of culture. The specific trajectory of the region's hyperbolic mode of comprehension, which often puts on a grotesque face, is possible precisely because of the discordant divisions and code-driven conventions that govern the cultural context of the region. The presence of strong binarities in the South connected with contrastive viewing of racial issues, white versus black, social status, gentility, versus, for instance, such slurs as white trash, or regional affiliations, northern versus southern, was reinforced by policies of the region as well as its cultural scripts. They regulated who one was, what one did, and how one spoke. These oppressive binary modes form the conceptual foundation of Southern decorum, and it is the oppressive character of these dualities that is violently contested by Southern hyperbole. In his famous essay, The Southerner as an American Writer, Hugh Holman famously looks at Southerners as, quote, reconciliation of opposites, arguing that one can find at the heart of the Southern riddle a union of opposites, a condition of instability. This merger of opposites, of repelling forces, requires a violent push to overcome this natural instability, as well as a strained selectiveness of mind to cope with the concurrence of opposites. In a more recent book, The New Mind of the South, Tracy Thompson talks about the intellectual Rubik's Cube of the American South, in which constant whitewashing of history and culture has generated a mosaic of contradictions, large and small. Tara McPherson stipulates that thinking about the South is infused with a certain degree of cultural schizophrenia, in which a traumatizing legacy of slavery collides with the institutionalized nostalgia for a mythical space that was never there. All those elements all those commentators point to the existence of this fundamental contrast at the level of meta-narrative about the region. This violent push to capture the paradox and to remove oneself from its influence, counterforce to the oppressive decorum of the South, is often hyperbolic in its cognitive trajectory. Just as the hyperbolic mode in rhetoric challenged the norms of stylistic proportion and balance, as well as the principle of artistic mimesis, So in the context of Southern culture and literature, the forceful hyperbolic contestation of the decorum allows us to engage and challenge the prescriptive norms of the Southern code. And as I tried to demonstrate in my book, Southern Hyperboles, a number of Southern authors have developed their own individual ways to engage with this hyperbolic instability. One example of those can be Catherine Ann Porter, whose short stories are a good example of the hyperbolic mode underpinning the narrative framework, which leads from the shocking violation of the decorum through its deconstruction to the reorganization of meanings, and finally to a novel perspective on the culture and its principles. The internal hyperbolic architecture of Catherine Ann Porter's short story, The Grave, demonstrates the protagonist's emancipation from patriarchal norms and gender prescriptivism. Through the exploration of the eponymous graves and the ritualistic flaying of a hunted rabbit, which affords a glimpse under the skin of the social decorum, Miranda, the protagonist of the story, experiences an epiphanic insight into the functioning of culture, which is governed by prescriptive gender roles. If, as argued by Joshua Ritter, the hyperbolic mode can be viewed as an epistemic process, an art of becoming, since by generating confusion through excess, hyperbole alters and creates meaning, the beginning of Porter's characters takes place through the violent force of hyperbolic contestation of gender decorum. One of the most recognizable forms of silent hyperbolic disruption is the grotesque. The organic link between the hyperbolic pattern of comprehension and the aesthetic of the disproportionate becomes clear when one considers how the grotesque engages and deconstructs the narrative system of aesthetic decorum. Jeffrey Harpham argues that the grotesque, quotes, stands at the margin of consciousness between the known and the unknown, the perceived and the unperceived, calling into question the adequacy of our ways of organizing the world. To people who cultivate a balanced sensitivity and who value the separation of categories within the decorum, the grotesque is scandalous or even openly unbearable. The confusion it brings primarily stems from its blatant disregard for the principles of representations and the rules of division. In effect, those dualisms define the margin of ambivalence inherent in the grotesque and generate cognitive tensions. Wherever there is a force code and a prescriptive decorum of clear-cut axiological positions, as in the case of the exclusive binarities of the South, the grotesque is bound to emerge. In other words, from the point of view of metafiguration, the South is unavoidably grotesque. The mythical reality of the grotesque revolves around the idea of perpetual excessive metamorphosis in which entities coalesce and permeate one another. The idea that things remain in hyperbolic flux can hardly be reconciled with post-Aristotelian topology when there is a distinctive label for everything, including the label maker. The Bakhtinian hyperbolized body that is at the same time open and remains akin to other bodies may be considered dangerous and effectively transforms into a cultural taboo as visible so often in the works of William Faulkner. To Patricia Jaeger, the body is turned into an excessive topos of Southern fiction that absorbs the continuous impact of social and racial violence, which is so prevalent in a culture devoid of any outlets. The Southern panoply of distorted bodies caught between categories and forms, the bodies in pain endows the somatic with the precarious power to meddle with the conflicted world and bear testimony to its traumas. As a figure in Southern fiction, the hyperbolic grotesque distorts the harmony because it records the body's social contamination and a host of scarring disturbances that have impacted it. To Patricia Yeager, the Southern preoccupation with the grotesque becomes a mimetic device, a witnessing transference of a quote, a version of history from the other to one's own body, end of quote. Thus, by recreating a space of disorientation, the grotesque body enters Southern text with the iconic power to dazzle the reader's senses and to open her eyes to the normality of the abnormal. This shocking effect of the hyperbolic and the excessive is often found in, for instance, Flannery O'Connor's stories, where she employs the grotesque to shock and terrorize her readers. Hyperbolic distortion can also serve as an epistemic vehicle, which can help to break away from the categories of the surrounding reality and to question its principles. In effect, exploring what is hidden beneath the normative system. Thus, by looking into the figurative framework of a text, one can also get a chance to glimpse the mind behind the language. The use of the hyperbolic mode is visible in a host of social Southern memoirs. In those texts, Southern authors like Richard Wright, Lillian Smith, or Willie Morris seek to break away from the oppressive culture and to reorganize their relationship with the region. In this agonizing process of their search for identity, the hyperbolic mode becomes a viable means of disassociation. By conjoining the opposites to demonstrate how bloated they actually are, and by challenging the decorum, the emerging new self of these authors can distance itself from its cultural roots and from the space to raise itself up from its original cultural position. The unruliness of the hyperbolic process allows for cultural decorum to be braven and broken, and ultimately secures the space for the author's self-reconstitution. In his study Anthropology, Hayden White stresses that every discourse is always as much about discourse itself as it is about objects that make up its subject matter, speaking about speaking. From this point of view, the exploration of the hyperbolic pattern of comprehension in Southern literature may allow the readers to reflect on the region and on the narrative processes used by Southern authors and on the complex dialectic engagement initiated in Southern writings. It is against this backdrop of the Southern decorum perpetuated through rigorous myth-making, prescriptive social and gender constructs, and historical whitewashing during the first decades of the 20th century that Southern fiction was able to develop its rebellious violence of the hyperbolic mode. And it is due to these pressures that a distinct aesthetics of the Southern grotesque managed to develop and flourish. I know I have 3 more minutes, so I'll say a few words about Lillian Smith, who is my, in the entry to the encyclopedia, is my author spotlight. Lillian Smith was born under, and her writings, especially Killers of the Dream, serve me to illustrate the meta-narrative mechanisms of Southern hyperbole. Born at the turn of the 20th century, Lillian Smith grew up in a patriarchal, middle-class white family in segregated Florida. This background made her, in the words of her biographer, Cobb, an unlikely crusader against the status quo. Smith's stay in China, where she worked as a director of music in a Methodist school, allowed her to reflect critically on Southern culture and to see its haunting paradoxes. Smith became an outspoken critic of segregation patriarchy, when the Smith family had to relocate due to economic problems. Her father set up in 1920 a private camp for girls in Georgia. In 1925, Smith took over its management, and soon she transformed it into a safe space where campers discussed such topics as sexuality, racial and gender roles, and reproductive rights. Smith challenged Jim Crow through her work, engaging all available means to be heard and often expressing frustration that her criticism of white supremacy was being overlooked and silenced. Smith's writing confronted the taboos of the South. Her best-selling novels Strange Fruit and Killers of the Dream generated fierce controversy at the time of their publication, as books demonstrated the exorbitant social principles of segregated South. Especially Killers of the Dream reported on her upbringing in the South and her breaking away from the haunted plasticity of the Southern mind, which enables it to hold two opposing ideas at the same time and to override the painful truth while with selective thinking. As she explains in The Killers of the Dream, I was in dialogue with myself as I wrote, as well as with my hometown and my childhood and history and the future and the past. Smith views herself as attached to the South by a metaphorical umbilical cord, and through which the oppressive culture has passed into her system. To sever the connection, she engages with the principles of her upbringing, yanking herself out of what she describes as intellectual deafness of Southern culture. To her, the region she grew up in was contaminated, haunted by four ghosts she describes as the continuing traumas of the South. To Smith, these guilt-ridden spectral paradoxes generated the region's hyperbolic tensions, which one could only placate through the uncompromising and ardently split of one's identity. The laceration of the connection with the region is a rapid jump away from the metaphors of racism. In the words of the narrator, a metamorphosis takes place. Something happens within a new chaos, and then slowly a new beginning. And this is precisely this new beginning is the final element of the meta-figurative trajectory in Smith's writings. And it is through this hyperbolic mode that Smith is able to recreate and reorganize herself as a Southerner. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Last up, we have Amy Schmidt, who is an assistant professor of English at Williams Baptist University in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. Her work appears in venues such as Southern Literary Journal, Arkansas Review, and The Americanist. And she's also the associate editor of the Civil Rights Reader, American Literature, and From Jim Crow to Reconciliation. Currently, she's working on a research project that examines the role that rice plays in Southern women's literature. So very interesting there. Dr. Schmidt.
Good morning. So the title of my talk today is Bring What Y'all Got to the Gumbo Pot, Literature and the Multi-Ethnic South. You have to say it like that too, or else it doesn't work. In his essay, Creating the Transnational South, Donald Nononi argues that the South has always already been multicultural, or one could say multi-ethnic. Thus, one cannot speak of, quote, the South with its complexities and multiplicities as a monolithic whole. To speak of multi-ethnic Souths is to acknowledge many Souths, or many ways of experiencing and interpreting the region that go beyond Black and white. You'll have to forgive me, I'll likely slip and use the grammatical singular, but know that when I'm doing that, I'm still assuming that theoretically and realistically, the South as singular doesn't exist. Unfortunately, the Southern literary canon often fails to reflect this variance, especially in terms of ethnicity and race. Instead, the canon reflects the region's Jim Crow era categorizations. Such inaccurate binary logic not only simplifies the region, but also deprives us of texts that enrich our conceptions of it and its literature. When I'm pushing undergraduate American Lit students to expand their notions of race and ethnicity in the South, I often use the analogy of gumbo. Most of these students have recognized that the melting pot representation of race in the US is inaccurate at best. And coming as they do from East Arkansas, they know a little something about gumbo, though they're more likely to be familiar with the duck rather than the seafood variant. Gumbo works as a shorthand for multiple ethnic groups in the South because it's the reality that produced the dish. Native American, West African, German, French, Spanish influences are all readily identifiable in most gumbo pots. Moreover, gumbo is something to be celebrated, at least for most of my students. So it reminds them that our complex social interactions can be productive. They shouldn't be, as some might have it, feared. Indeed, the principle, if you will, behind a good gumbo is that you can make it with whatever's laying around, whatever you got. Items otherwise destined for the compost pile. The dish takes near refuse and makes it something mouth-watering. Those who might shy away from examining our region's ethnic complexities may do so because it's not always pretty. To examine the South as multi-ethnic is to acknowledge many different kinds of exploitation. However, a number of Southern authors have taken the refuse of their experiences and created something as diverse as it is delicious, what we can call, if we will, Southern literature. Scholars have already worked to include previously marginalized voices, but we must continue the work. The Southern literary canon should reflect the multi-ethnic experiences of the region and disrupt outdated binaries. Additionally, with insights gained from expanding the canon, we can reread texts, examining how Black and white authors portray the multi-ethnic landscapes of the South. Ultimately, conceptualizing the South as multi-ethnic allows us access to a more varied and interesting canon, and one that more accurately reflects the lived realities of the region. How we define the South has always been up for debate. Like ethnic and racial categories, regional identity is a construction, and regional boundaries are porous and arbitrary. However, constructions of region and race both produce material inequities, both in lived experiences and in literary canonization. For far too long, Southern literature meant white literature. Then it meant white and Black Southern literature. These connotations unfortunately resulted from the Academy's reflection of the South's segregated landscape, an inheritance from the Jim Crow era that insists on dividing us into two and only two racial categories. Reading Southern literature with a multi-ethnic lens means incorporating at least two strategies. One, including authors who have been overlooked because they don't fit into the binary categories. And two, rereading canonized authors in ways that emphasize the region's multi-ethnicity. The first approach extends the work scholars have already accomplished. Since at least the 1970s, Southernists have been revising the canon set out by the fugitives, aka agrarians, aka new critics. In Inventing Southern Literature, Michael Kryling argues for the inclusion of authors marginalized by the agrarian canon. And he exposes the ways that ideology, prejudices, and assumptions shapes that canon. In Dirt and Desire, Patricia Yeager goes further and, quote, dynamites the rails to revise the tropes and themes we consider Southern, and thus to integrate even more diverse texts. More recently, scholars like Melanie Benson Taylor and Eric Anderson reveal how a Jim Crow view of race ignores Southern Native Americans, their experiences, and their texts. Including Native American texts like Gary Hobson's novel, The Last of the Ophos, and Leanne Howe's novel, Shell Shaker, in the Southern canon provides a more complete understanding of the region's histories and cultures. Hobson's novel explores the intersections of poverty, masculinity, and leisure in ways reminiscent of grit-lit writers like Harry Crews. Importantly, Howe's characters must negotiate the demands, informed by violence and gender constraints, of communities and their histories. Ultimately, their texts ask us to rethink how we approach other text portrayals of Native Americans. In Go Down Moses, William Faulkner depicts Sam as a deliberate loner who communes with nature, especially with animals, in ways that white and Black characters cannot. This superficial rendering of Sam, however, not only employs stereotypes, but also minimizes the exploitation of people and land. In other words, the lumber industry's incursion into the Delta naively, naive on Ike's part, maybe naive on Faulkner's part too, parallels the initial Native American loss of land to colonizers who built plantations but kept enough wilderness to hunt in. Contextualizing such depictions with Native American perspectives enriches our interpretations. It shifts our viewpoints and provides more nuanced analyses. Similarly, conceptualizing the U.S. South as multi-ethnic depends also upon the work of Global South scholars who examine the region's exploitative power dynamics both at home and abroad. These scholars draw on post-colonial theorists such as Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha. Several collections, including Look Away, Just Below South, and Hemispheric American Studies, argue that the region is part of an international network of plantation economies created by the transatlantic slave trade. Viewing the South through this, quote, plantation paradigm enables us to explore the region's relationships, historically and presently, to regions other than the U.S. North. Moreover, when combined with insights of critical race theorists such as Henry Gates, Houston Baker, and Thaddeus Davis, such global connections highlight African survivals in the region's literature. Using these theoretical lenses enables us to read texts like Charles Chestnut's The Conjure Woman, Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men, and Julia Peterkin's Scarlet Sister Mary in more productive ways. Naming only one Hurston text here seems strange, as nearly all of her texts depict African-American vernacular traditions, but Mules and Men is one of her most explicit examples. Perhaps even stranger is my inclusion of Peterkin in this list, who is an affluent white woman in South Carolina. But her portrayals of African survivals in South Carolina are noteworthy and situate her texts alongside those of Hurston and Chestnut when they portray oral and spiritual traditions that resist exploitation. Additionally, a global perspective focuses attention on contemporary texts like Cynthia Shearer's novel, The Celestial Jukebox, and the poems included in Yusuf Kumunyaka's Neon Vernacular and Nikki Finney's Rise. Shearer's novel depicts an African immigrant negotiating rural Mississippi, while Kumunyaka's poetry draws on his experiences in rural Louisiana and in South Vietnam. Finney's collection of poems contextualizes rice farming in South Carolina within the slave trade and its impacts. Ultimately, emphasizing the U.S. South's global relationships reminds us of its colonial era, characterized not only by chattel slavery, but also by Native American removal. Studying the multi-ethnicity of the South requires us to examine its relationships, not only those it has with other regions, but also those among groups residing within the region itself. The latter can often be even more complicated than the former because of the social intimacy that often and ironically exists alongside of continued segregation and exploitation. While different ethnic groups have different histories and traditions, they share certain experiences with the South's exploitative hierarchies, characterized by large disparities between the privileged and the disenfranchised. Looking at the experiences of mine immigrants working in a North Carolina poultry plant, or German POWs working on rice farms in the Arkansas Delta, adds layers to our understanding of how the South's economy exploits in ways that go beyond antebellum slavery and Jim Crow sharecropping. Such exploitation reminds us that even though identities are constructed, the hierarchies that contain them create material realities of poverty, specifically the lack of access to healthcare, education, and other vital resources. Importantly, the exclusion of text from the literary canon perpetuates these material realities, often by simply allowing marginalized experiences to be overlooked. Approaching Southern literature with a multi-ethnic perspective encourages us to study texts that depict otherwise overlooked experiences. For instance, reading South Florida through the Cuban-American lens of Roberto Fernandez's novel Holy Radishes disrupts narratives about both the South and the U.S. in terms of their relationship to the Caribbean in general and to communist Cuba in particular. Additionally, several Asian American authors call the South home and productively complicate what that means. The novels of Lan Cao and Monique Trong illustrate how the South's global relationships impact socioeconomic dynamics within the region. Notably, the novels of Fernandez and Cao also depict immigrant experiences, exposing common assumptions about race and ethnicity within the region as reductive. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about Lan Cao's 1997 novel, Monkey Bridge, so that I can provide a clear illustration of what exactly I'm suggesting we do with the text. Unfortunately, scholars rarely refer to Cao's text as Southern literature. However, if we expand our conceptions of what is Southern, we gain a previously ignored perspective of the region. Born in Saigon, Cao is a refugee of the Vietnam War, referred to in Vietnam as the, quote, American War. After immigrating, she largely lived in Virginia with her mother, and then she went on to attend college and then later law school. The novel Monkey Bridge connects Vietnam's Mekong Delta to the US's Virginia through the experiences of Ma and her mother Tan, both refugees of the Vietnam War. Highlighting the exploitation of both people and land, Cao examines the relationship between the U.S. South and South Vietnam through the country's economies, politics, and environments. Moreover, she emphasizes the unequal power dynamics involved in those relationships and depicts the trauma resulting from those disparities. Significantly, she does so with conventionally Southern tropes, such as the use of a Faulknerian ledger to grapple with family legacy, economic realities, and sexual exploitation. The ledger illustrates how the exploitation of people and land in South Vietnam mirrors that of plantations in the U.S. South. However, Cao's depiction of the U.S. military's use of Agent Orange in the Mekong Delta leaves no question about the power differences between the two countries. Furthermore, Ma's and Tan's experiences as largely unwanted immigrants in the U.S. South reveal not only the multi-ethnic reality of the region, but also the socioeconomic hierarchies that inform it. Along with war veterans, Ma and Tan are reminders not only to Southerners, but also to Americans of a war they want to forget. Struggling to negotiate Virginia's socioeconomic landscape, Tan nostalgically longs for the rice fields of South Vietnam, preferring their now poisoned soil to the alienation she experiences in the Southern U.S. Thus, Cao illustrates the powerful lure of where one identifies as home, making her novel a rather Southern one indeed. In addition to including new voices, we can also reread canonized texts with a multi-ethnic perspective. Rereading canonized texts is a strategy suggested in The Empire Writes Back as a post-colonial approach to literature, and it is one that has already been taken up by numerous Faulkner scholars who productively and insightfully revisit some of his most read texts, such as Absalom, Absalom. In addition to Faulkner's, we can reread other texts using a specifically multi-ethnic lens. For example, George Washington Cable's Old Creole Days, Kate Chopin's Bayou Folk, and Ernest Gaines of Love and Dust portray identity positions in South Louisiana and complicate Jim Crow with Cajun and Creole experiences. Similarly, texts by contemporary Gulf Coast authors, such as Jasmine Ward's novel Sing Unburied Sing and Natasha Trethewey's poetry collection Thrall, examine the intersections of identity and legacy, and they expose racial and ethnic binaries as problematic and outdated. Importantly, reading immigrant narratives like those mentioned earlier can highlight different, regularly overlooked parts of already canonized texts. For instance, novels by Zora Neale Hurston and James Weldon Johnson contain descriptions of immigrant workers in South Florida. Though not often commented on as such, Their Eyes Were Watching God portrays workers of color on the muck, and the autobiography of an ex-colored man depicts immigrant workers in a cigar factory. Adding even more texture to the multi-ethnic social fabric, other canonized authors depict European immigrant experiences of the South. In her short story, The Displaced Person, collected in A Good Man is Hard to Find, Flannery O'Connor illustrates how Polish immigrants negotiate Jim Crow constructions, and she critiques those constructions by linking them to the Holocaust. Doing so, O'Connor not only frames the U.S. South in relationship to other regions and countries, but she also illustrates the inadequacy and the inaccuracy of depicting the South in black and white. In I Don't Hate the South, Houston Baker argues that, quote, the South is a metonym for what went and continues to go wrong with America, end quote. If we employ a multi-ethnic perspective, perhaps our region can reverse the current national trends and make something go right for once. You'll indulge me, I want to go back to the gumbo for a moment. Whether it's duck or seafood or some other kind of gumbo, it's nearly always served on rice. The rice itself points us towards how globalized and multi-ethnic our region was and is. Take, for example, how it connects the region to countries in Southeast Asia. And as the recent film Minari illustrates, it also reveals what some seem to find is the surprising amount of diversity within the region. The rise in discrimination and violence against Asian Americans during the past year should give us a sense of urgency about how we as Southernists and as Southerners frame and examine our region. It's imperative we rethink our assumptions about who and what is Southern, who and what belongs, and that we interrogate honestly what impact such constructions have. If rice is the foundation of our gumbo dish, we've got to examine it first and more closely than we ever have before. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Schmidt, and thank you to everyone else on the panel. This has been interesting and productive, I think, and we do have a little bit of time for some Q&A so as to more accurately reflect a traditional conference panel, even though we'll be the only audience members here. So I have questions I can throw your way, and I'll invite everyone to chime in as they will in a kind of roundtable format. And I guess since you're still on my screen, Dr. Schmidt, I'll start with you. What I really want to ask you about is gumbo, because my family is from Louisiana, so gumbo is seafood. It is not duck, so right. I think that's sacrilege. But I'm going to go with something a little more academic before we start.
No.
No. Anyone else got an opinion about gumbo?
No, we do chicken and sausage.
Yeah, my dad does that, and I find that I recoil at that even.
But wait. One last thing. I don't do it with rice anymore. I use the French bread instead of rice now.
Really?
I know that's sacrilege. I like it. I know that's sacrilege, but I like it.
Sounds good to me, actually. Sounds good to me.
It still sounds good, yeah.
Good. Can't go wrong. As you point out, it's the stuff on top, right, that matters. It's the blend. So it's a useful metaphor. But I guess what I really want to drive us at very quickly, just to kind of ask a broad question, is discussion of a canon, right? You point out the fact that we have this kind of narrowly constructed canon that comes out of the confluence of agrarians and new critics and et cetera, and that we're looking to broaden that out. But initially, I think one of the reactions that as an industry we had was to explode the canon, to do away with it. Do you think that we're back to canon formation again? Because I personally think that the destruction of any sense of there being canonicity might have been a bridge too far or something. So I'm curious about how you weigh in on the idea of canon.
I'm not sure we ever destroyed the canon.
You don't think?
I don't think so. I think that's what we wanted to do. And
Right.
I think we made some really great changes and had some really thought-provoking conversations. But I don't know that we did destroy it. And I mean, I also, honestly, the idea of a canon doesn't make me that uncomfortable as long as it's an inclusive canon, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that may be a more realistic move than trying to completely destroy the canon, because how do you teach, right? Like, how do we prepare undergraduate students, especially for graduate school, if, you know, there's certain things that they need to read, whether we like the author or not, whether we like what the author says or not, right? We teach them so that they're prepared for graduate study. And so to me, the solution is not so much to explode the canon, which, like I said, I'm not sure we ever did, is to just expand it.
Yeah, I agree. We had conversations about that topic actually informing the book that we're all a part of, is looking at certain authors that the editors aren't particularly, you know, they're not really authors that we teach a lot or are fond of, but we understand the centrality that they have to have in some ways to that foundational move that you're talking about. So it's interesting to hear you say.
I was going to say, one thing about Amy's, I was really thinking a lot while during Amy's talk, and I have issues with canon, you know, on a personal level, but some things that stuck out to me, because some of the texts that you've mentioned I haven't read, but I'm thinking about other texts that I have read, specifically with Vietnam immigration to Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
You said with Comignacca, Janero Keeley Smith, who was kind of a newer author, not, you know, been around a few years, has a book of poetry about, you know, his grandfather in Vietnam after the war in re-education camps, and then his family moving to Louisiana. So half and half, right? I'm thinking about, I think I taught Claude McKay's Banana Bottom in a Southern literature class, you know, with the immigrant. So kind of that whole discussion, I think, is really important and illuminating that we need to think about. And one thing that, top of a lot of things that kind of stuck out to me when you were talking, was that focus on Louisiana too, and the Cajun Creole, with Cable and Gaines, and especially with Gaines, with his discussions of Cajun and Creole, and that it's not just black and white. I think it's very important that we think about, not just in regard to race within that context, like you said, immigrants as well, and things like that. Can you expand upon that a little bit? Because one of the texts that I have in my talk too is the Weaver text, which I never thought about Argentinian or Latin American immigrants into, you know, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement, and the ways that she navigates, like I said, black and white. Sometimes she's treated as black because she's from Argentina and an immigrant, and other times she's treated as white because with black characters. So that kind of navigation of those constructions, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another illustration of how inadequate, right, these Jim Crow binaries are, that I think but culturally, I think people socially still hold on to those, right? And you were talking a lot about stereotypes of the South, right? I think a lot of stereotypes also hinge on those racial binaries. And so South Louisiana, like Gumbo, I think provides a good starting point, because South Louisiana's racial structure, like the Caribbean or Central America, was never as simple as you're either black or you're white, right? That it, even during Jim Crow, it was more complicated than that. And so, you know, if you kind of start from there and then start adding in immigrant experiences and, you know, different regions within the South and those experiences and what those look like, I mean, the list just sort of goes on and on and on.
Yeah, I taught Ernest Gaines as a gathering of all men to education students, graduate education students this semester. and they were kind of shocked and blown away by the social hierarchies within
Yeah.
that text, with the white landowners, Cajun. There's not a bunch of discussion of Creole in there, and then with blacks at the bottom. And the other thing that jumped out to me, one of the students pointed out, which I think is important, but I explained to her why. And like I said, these are education students, graduate students. She was like, why, this is a multi-ethnic American lit class. She was like, why are we reading so many African-American authors? Because I don't think as African-American as multi-ethnic, I think of it as American lit.
Oh.
So kind of that discussion, and then kind of having that discussion, and this was online, so it's hard to totally have it, the discussion of canon, right? And that construction.
If I may add a slightly different perspective here, in the sense that, you know, I teach American literature and I teach Southern literature in Poland, right? I've been listening to your discussion with a lot of interest, in the sense that I keep on thinking of how this translates, you know, the discussion of the presence of these binaries translates, and the presence and the possible deconstruction of the canon translates into my experience as a teacher of American literature, in the context that my job as an academic and as a teacher predominantly is to acquaint my students with those binaries, which are well, in a way, taken for granted. The knowledge of those that is taken for granted by your students, right? So I'm teaching classes that consist 90% of female students, 10% of male students. All of them are white. They have never held a gun. They have never seen a gun. Now, I personally have. I think the first time I saw a gun was in the US. So I've never held
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Yeah, that was you in Colombia, if I remember. Yeah, but you know, it's in this sense, it's challenging, and interestingly challenging, and it allows me to approach those texts and those binaries in a yet different level, because again, a class that my students don't know anyone who's not white. They have never met anyone who's not white. They've never been to the US, and their language capability, I mean, is fantastic, in the sense that I can read through Faulkner very easily, and they swallow Joyce, Faulkner. So language is not a barrier here, but the acquaintance with these binaries and the attempt at the deconstruction of those binaries, right? In my teaching, I mean, it presupposes that they know these binaries, they know these elements of culture, and trust me, it's very hard to teach Faulkner to someone who has no practical knowledge of racial issues, has never experienced those ever, right?
So does that mean, Michał, that your discussion of the hyperbolic is a harder climb with your Polish students, because
I would say so. Yes, it is, in a sense that I actually teach a class based on my research as part of the grant, and it forces me to do a lot of additional. I mean, I wouldn't have to do it if I was teaching this class in the US. So just wanted to show this perspective. Also, also in the context of the translations, which is fairly often omitted, in the sense that, you know, as much Faulkner is read in English as in other languages, right? Yeah. So and when you translate and when you read translations, students of literature, general literature at the Jagiellonian University, read Southern literature, but they read it in translation, and this is yet another barrier, and this makes the whole experience more foreign, as it were, or exotic, as it were. So that was just a perspective that I wanted to share.
I appreciate that. Let me ask you, as long as we're talking about the hyperbole, and you talk about it as a mode of comprehension for facing those kind of restrictive binaries of the Southern tradition, what about on the other side of things, where you have thinkers and writers who are committed to those binaries? And I'm thinking about, like lost cause mythology or something like that. Does the hyperbolic have a role there, or how do things shift there?
I don't think these authors belong to the canon, as it were, exactly because they did not make an effort to challenge those binaries, as it were. So I think it's I mean, great that it's my personal uptake on what makes literature good literature as it impactful is that it engages the surrounding reality on a fundamental level, right? So you painfully deconstruct those building blocks, right? So if you go with the flow, I mean, you're not necessarily read after one. Yes. So, but on the other hand, if you do engage those binaries that Amy so beautifully discussed in her talk, if you engage them in a creative way, I mean that you inescapably engage in this dialogue with the culture that you're part of, right? So, as was the case with Lillian Smith. I envy Matthew so much because he's right. I think he's in at Lillian Smith's house at the bottom of the Screamer Mountain, right? So that makes me amazing interior. Right. So I
nice.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question about your work on Smith. So I think I love the idea that the grotesque works as a challenge to decorum, right? And I totally agree with everything you're saying about Smith. Killers of the Dream. Here's my question. Killers of the Dream. Do you ever find that Smith can't, and Matthew, you should chime in on this too if you want, that Lillian Smith can't quite 100% extricate all of that decorum, or at least the logic that dictates it from her work? I mean, one of the reasons I find Killers of the Dream a fascinating text is because it's so revolutionary in some ways, and yet in other ways, you're reading a text by this affluent white woman in Georgia, right? That it's that sort of peeks through in different places throughout the text.
You want to go first, Michał? I got kind of thoughts.
Yeah, you go first, maybe.
So I think what stands out to me with Killers and with her work is that she is challenging those constructions, for one. I think even as a white affluent woman, she knows her position and she challenges it. Now, the question of does she ever rid herself of those cultural kind of baggage that comes with it, I would say no, because none of us do, I don't think.
Right.
I mean, that's something that I myself think about and deal with. So I think that part of what makes Killers and even her later work important is the fact that she is working. It is a process that she's working through. But you see her, I would say, in some letters and things where it's really kind of problematic. I would say, especially just looking at it now. And I think about, I don't know if you've seen the documentary, Hal Jacobs documentary, but there's a scene, there's a moment, I forgot what TV show she's on, but it's during an interview, and she is presenting herself as that white Southern woman, very kind of genial, kind of smiling, and that's how she is presenting herself. I would definitely say after the camp, and probably even during the camp when she's trying to get campers here. So I think that a lot of that's a rhetorical performance, at least in my opinion. And she's working through it. But, like I said, I think with all of us, it's hard for us to get away with it because we come into a world where we're, bombarded with it from various angles, right?
No, I agree. That's my take on it too. I was just curious what y'all thought.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's this, Killers of the Dream, that's a process, and that's how you have to. That's, I guess, how you should look at it, and especially if you juxtapose it against the canvas of so many other Southern autobiographies. I mentioned Willie Morris, but there's one called Catherine Dupré-Lampkin, The Making of a Southerner,
Yeah.
right? Which is in so much more strongly insaturated
Yes.
with this voice. So they're although Catherine Dupré-Lampkin uses another interesting metaphor, that of Twilight Zone, right? So it's curious that Lillian Smith talks about the intellectual deafness. So the metaphor of hearing metaphor, while Catherine Dupré-Lampkin talks about blindness and Twilight Zone. So the metaphor of sight. But it's a most definitely it's a process, and I agree with both what you said, that it's visible in this text, which in retrospect, I mean, you read it from a completely different angle right now that you in the 1950s and 60s.
But I think that's one thing that I think is important about Smith, is that she is laying bare that process for you. I think that's what Killers of the Dream so kind of powerful, especially as a white Southern reader, right? Is that she is part of that we that she discovered. She is very much a part of that. So yeah.
That's cool. So we're getting a little bit low on time, but before we run out, I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about superheroes. So I want to ask Matthew a couple questions about specifically the superhero portions of your talk on comics. I think there's some interesting things there, and I guess just because it came up in your talk, I'm curious about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the presentation of the new Captain America, who you mentioned in the comics is coming from Alabama, and of course in the show he's from Georgia.
Yeah, but
sorry,
but they don't discuss it, which is kind of
that was my question. He's kind of presented in a darker, almost villainous light, and I'm wondering if any of that informs it.
That's how he's partly presented in the comics too. What frustrated me about the series is you get that he's from Georgia, yet there's no kind of play up with that. There's no kind of play up with him and Lamar. He has, I think, he has a black partner or wife, right? That's not played up at all. So he's kind of this embodiment of the South's and the nation's sins, as being from the South, I would say, partly because he's very nationalistic, very overtly over patriotic, right? And you don't get those discussions. The other thing about that series that doesn't get played up either is that Sam is from New Orleans, and I believe in the comics he's originally from Harlem.
Oh, okay.
So that aspect that leads to, I think, a very interesting kind of discussion they could actually play with a little bit, but they didn't. And in the comics, Sam's not, of course, with that series or with that part of the series, but there's a really kind of interesting couple of stories in there. One in the comics where John Walker goes to Alabama and basically infiltrates a moral majority kind of alt-right, group that's trying to shut down porn businesses, basically. So very much a time of the 80s, and there's one where he kind of deals with his family and kind of that history too. So there's interesting things there, but like I said, I was really disappointed the series didn't play that up. And I think they could have. I mean, they're going a different direction, but it would. Yeah,
there's always this ongoing consideration that I was thinking about this when you were talking about the presentation of like Rogue's background and things like that, where there's an interesting thing about how much of the contextual background needs to be accessed in order to be a kind of good steward of the history, right? And where that gets into contrast with the actual drives of the storyline, right? And so I think I'm wondering where that is in terms of, what is the obligation, I guess, of the comic creator to bring issues like the troubling past.
I think it's important because I mean, I think back to comics during the 50s. What led to the Comics Code, the EC comics, were very much socially active and combating racism and discrimination and racial violence, and those led to the Comics Codes. And I think comics have always been, political within their context. Don McGregor, the first time Black Panther gets his series, he brings Black Panther and Monica Lynn. So he brings T'Challa and Monica Lynn's his love interest to Georgia to fight the Klan, in the second part of kind of his series. And there's discussion in the South, but even within that, McGregor's from the Northeast, I think. There's a moment where he depicts Monica Lynn and her sister, who's murdered, playing in the dirt. And he references Eldridge Cleaver and James Baldwin, kind of like, passively saying like they don't know this area basically, or something like that. And talking about the expansion of the canon, this made me think, Amy, Trudier Harris does this in her book, The Scary Mason-Dixon Line, but even James Baldwin, in an interview, he said, for all intents and purposes, I'm a Southerner.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were born in the South. 10 more minutes if they stayed, I would have been born in the South. So even that kind of discussion, of migration. I mean, Ernest Gaines didn't start writing until after he went to California, right? And granted, he grew up in the South in Louisiana, but he couldn't start writing about the South until he went to California, and that's where everything came. So even kind of those discussions, I think, are important.
Mm-hmm.
And one last thing, I didn't bring these in there because I didn't even think about them when I was writing the piece, but and I haven't read it, but there's a graphic novel adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And those books, and I haven't read that, but thinking about kind of looking at, the literature, I reread Mockingbird recently, and I know Michał teaches it because it's part of that Southern canon, have big issues with Mockingbird. But that intro lays out that Native American displacement. It lays out how the Finches get their job. And if we look at that kind of and take that apart, you can bring in Elias Boudinot, and you can bring in John Ross, you can bring in the treaty, and you can bring in all of those discussions to reframe kind of that narrative, right?
Okay, may I ask which Mockingbird? Because Ghost Set a Watchman is the first version of the Mockingbird. So in a way, we have two Mockingbirds.
The first version that was printed, that was published in the
right.
60s. That Lillian Smith has on her shelf, but said she never read because I think it came out the year if I remember.
Yeah.
And I see it on the shelf in the library. So
the one extensively edited by Tay Hohoff. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, sadly, I think that we are probably out of time here. We're going to exceed the typical restraints for a conference panel, and we want to cling to it as much as possible. This has been, though, an interesting presentation from all of you, and a great discussion, especially a welcome one in this COVID time of what feels sort of like an intellectual desert to me at times. I've missed this sort of engagement. So I want to thank you all, Dr. Schmidt, Dr. Choiński, Dr. Teutsch, for taking part here in this panel and taking part in the Routledge Companion to the Literature of the U.S. South, which will be forthcoming. Best of luck this summer and as we move into more normalcy.
Thank you.
Thank you.